You are listening to the Cresco Wealthcast, a podcast brought to you by Cresco Wealth Management of Wellington Altus Private Wealth. I'm your host, Dimitri, and I wanted to bring a podcast from the world of wealth that was really just easy to follow. And from time to time, I'm going to be bringing in members of the team. We'll be bringing in external guests and really providing some good information that are inspired from those coffee talk conversations that not just we're having, but that you're having as well. You can follow the podcast on www.cresco.podbean.com, or if you're on Spotify, you can just search for the Cresco Wealthcast. And last but not least, please do not forget to subscribe to my channel on Instagram, which is at The Finance Greek. And welcome back to another edition of the Cresco Wealthcast. Very excited to have another guest join us outside of Wayne Boer, Senior Financial Planner within Cresco Wealth Management. We also have Jenna Carvalho from Guardian Estate Company. This is a company that you have started. It's very intriguing. I'm not going to butcher the whole intro. I'm going to let you do it and cue it up. But Jenna, first and foremost, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Cresco. Please introduce and tell us a bit about what you're up to.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's exciting to talk about estates, and I'll take the chance whenever I can. So thanks for having me. Yes, I started Guardian Estate Company about 2 years ago, and what we do is really help clients navigate the different options available to them when it comes to professional executors and trustees. There wasn't really a neutral third party helping clients educate themselves and find the different solutions, and so we fit that gap and help clients get peace of mind with respect to their estate plans.
I want to point something out as well, and one thing we say here at Cresco is the best decision is the most informed decision. And when I was navigating your website and getting a bit of the 411, I wanted to read something that was very profound. That you're here to help solve a problem, and that limited information and resources to help people make that informed decision. I thought that was very important because in our world, in our respective worlds, it's nothing that typically gets overly shopped around, and you go with the flow, or you go with what you think you know. And I thought that was very profound on your website.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of kick things off, Jenna, one of the things that we like to focus on with our clients here is to make sure that they have good, robust estate plans in place. Late last year, I want to say, we had a guest speaker, Tom Deans, come to talk to some of our clients about his book called Willing Wisdom, about having a successful transition from one generation to another. And we had a Q&A with him afterwards. And one of the things that really came out of that was a lot of questions around the role of an executor, what they do, how I choose an executor. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation with you today. I like to use analogies, sports analogies sometimes. I think sometimes if you think of a football game, you got a coach who's drafting maybe some plans on the side, running some routes, but the coach doesn't actually join the game. I kind of feel that way with our wills sometimes. When we're crafting an estate plan, we're coming up with a game plan from the side, but then we have to give that plan to somebody else to put that in place. Whether that's a quarterback in a game, whether it's an executor with our estate plan, I see a lot of similarities there. And so just like football, it's a key role. We need to be wise about that to ensure success. So I was wondering if maybe we could start today by talking a little bit about what the role of an executor is, and if you could maybe tell us kind of what their job description is.
Well, I will say that the job of an executor is challenging, and it spans many months. So an executor really needs to step into the shoes of the individual that passes away and wrap up all of their affairs. So if the individual had bank accounts, they need to deal with the bank accounts. If they had insurance policies, real estate, corporate assets, digital assets, I know that's becoming a big thing. So the executor really needs to do some discovery and finding out whatever the deceased owned, collect that information, consolidate that information, apply to the court typically, to obtain what we call as the grant of probate, to actually be able to deal with those assets, collect them in, and disperse to the beneficiaries. So typically the average estate takes somewhere between 18 to 24 months here in Alberta, and the executor needs to be there for the entire journey, keeping the beneficiaries up to date and staying on top of all the accounting as well.
That's a lot.
Yes.
And so it'll lead perfectly into the next question. How do you choose the executor? What do you need to look for? Especially in we'll take it in your world where if you were advising, you should look for these key qualities or this type of relationship.
Great question, $1 million question right there. It can be different for each family. So I would say some of the key characteristics you want to look for in an executor is, number one, their age. Are they older than you? If so, maybe they're not the best choice because they may not be around when you need them the most. Location. Are they going to be in the same jurisdiction for that 18 to 24 month period? Are they traveling a lot? Do they have the time and ability to actually do the role? Knowledge is another thing. I mean, you don't need to be an expert in all the different facets of an estate administration, but you need to be organized. You need to have the right skills and know when to seek help. And that help, of course, could be legal, accounting, financial advice. And you also want to have someone who's even-minded or business-minded. There's going to be a lot of different tasks associated with the estate administration, and you want somebody to be able to be, calm during those different conflicting priorities, and also calm when answering the beneficiaries' questions, because that's a challenge too.
Well, it's interesting you say that it's a challenge. Do you have any stories or examples of challenges that some executors have faced dealing with beneficiaries, whether that's the question of where's my money, or other types of scenarios like that maybe you could share?
Sure. So I wouldn't say any specific one story, because this comes up quite often, is beneficiaries believe that the executor can just take the will into the bank, collect the money and disperse it, and it's done within a week. And I'm sure you've dealt with individuals who have that sort of preconceived notion, but essentially an estate takes much longer. And so the executor's role is to educate those beneficiaries, give them a reason to be patient, and keep them up to date as the estate goes on. So some beneficiaries are very reasonable. They check in once in a while, receive their statements, ask questions when reasonable to do so. Others, you might get a phone call every day saying, "Where's my money?
Yeah.
I need to buy a house," or "I'm going on a trip." So it's really difficult to know what type of beneficiaries you're dealing with until you're in that situation.
We also call that parenting.
Yes.
The same type of questions get asked.
What does a typical timeline look like for an executor who's administering an estate? You've talked about 18 months. Obviously it depends. It depends on what's in it. But what's kind of happening in the back end when an executor is working that takes time?
Great question. So a lot of the initial stages that executor needs to do is information gathering, write to all the institutions that the deceased dealt with, consolidate the information of what assets they held, as well as what liabilities they still owe, and consolidate that and provide it to the court, as I mentioned, as well to beneficiaries who are entitled to see that. So that takes some time. It takes a couple months. Maybe the deceased had all their information sent to them electronically. How do you get into that? How do you get those statements that you need to do? And how do you prove to those institutions that you have the authority to ask those questions? So I would say, the initial information stage is a couple months. And then once you apply for probate, luckily in Alberta, it's a much faster process than it used to be. But once you apply for probate, you might get it back, within 3 or 4 weeks. And then you're able to collect those assets into the estate and consider an interim distribution to beneficiaries. It really depends on the types of assets held. If you have a lot of cash, maybe you want to disperse a portion of assets or a portion of the cash before the final estate administration is complete. But generally speaking, you could probably do an interim distribution within 6 to 9 months, and provide the accounting all to the beneficiaries so they have an opportunity to review it and approve it too. So that's sort of the initial stage. I know there's lots of steps here. Through that timeline, you want to file a deceased tax return. So there needs to be a tax return done up to date of death, as well as there's another tax return for any income earned after death. If the deceased was not up to speed on their tax returns, you also have to file for the period of time that they missed. So that, of course, can take time, and dealing with CRA, as I'm sure lots of listeners know, we don't necessarily know how long it'll take to get a response back. So there are a lot of tasks, but also a lot of waiting for those different steps, for probate, for receiving a response back from CRA, and then also providing accounting to beneficiaries takes time, and for them to review it and approve it. And selling real estate takes time, so that's also a chunk of time in there. If the deceased had privately held business assets, corporate shares, there's certain tax planning that needs to be done, and I'm sure you're aware that also takes a lot of time to ensure it's done properly and to save taxes. So all those things to say, it depends on the estate, and it's really important to know what assets the deceased held to know what you have to do during that course of administration.
Mm-hmm. You said it a couple of times, applying for probate, getting a grant of probate. I know that means something a little different in different provinces, because there's fees assigned with it, there's waiting, there's applications. For those who are listening today who have maybe heard about probate, can you explain what it is and why an executor has to get probate, or maybe when an executor does not need to get probate?
Of course. So probate is essentially a document that the court provides, giving the executor the authority to collect assets from the various institutions that the deceased may have worked with. So it's really the institutions who request probate. It's not needed if the institutions don't need probate. So for example, if I had an estate, I passed away, maybe I had $10,000 with a bank and nothing else. Most likely you won't need probate for that type of situation. If you have more than, ballpark range around 30,000 with any institution, you'll need probate in order for that institution to release the assets, because they're really trying to protect themselves, and knowing that the will that the executor is bringing forward is the last will and testament, and there's not going to be new wills that are found. So the court does provide that extra level of security. The other reason you might need probate is if the deceased held real property in their name alone. So a house, if it was only in their name, it wasn't joint by right of survivorship, land titles will require that grant of probate to transfer the name from the deceased into someone else's name.
And then what's up with the fees? I mean, Alberta, we're a real low fee, but that's not the same across the country.
It's not. I always joke Alberta is a great place to die because it is a low-cost probate province. So
it's also a great place to live.
I should think more like you.
Yeah, we're all planning ahead here. You've done a great job.
So in Alberta, it's around $500 flat fee, regardless of the size of your estate. In BC and Ontario are some of the highest jurisdictions. It's 1.5% of the value of your estate. To get that grant of probate. If you do live and die in Alberta and most of your assets are here, you can probate all your assets here, other than the assets that may be in BC or Ontario or Saskatchewan, and then you just need probate for that specific asset in that other jurisdiction. So the 1.5% is only charged on the asset in that other jurisdiction, which is nice for a lot of Albertans with cottages in BC.
So I want to go back to even your business a little bit as well, and how you tie it all together in what you're doing, because you've created a real niche for yourself in the marketplace, really out of this demand. So I want to get in the perspective of someone listening saying, okay, got all this information, got step one, but where do I go? What do I do with this information right now? What happens?
So if a client does need a professional executor, that's really where I can provide some value. I take the client's information and we seek out different options on a no-name basis to various professional executors in the market. And we can compare options on the basis of cost, capacity of the professional executor, experience, longevity in the market, ability to navigate the needs of the beneficiaries. So anything that's important to the executor, we can pursue with those. Important to the client, we can pursue with those executors. And then the client really gets, at the end of the day, a nice, neat report showing the 3 best options for their specific scenario. And then they have more knowledge and education to make that choice, determine if it is the best choice to choose a professional or if they still want to choose a family member. And it just makes the whole process much less time consuming and more comforting knowing that they have the knowledge to make that informed decision.
Are there some people in particular that really should be thinking about using a corporate executor or a professional executor to help with this part of their estate planning?
Yeah, so I would say there's 4 reasons you might consider a professional executor. One is if your assets are complex. So maybe you have assets in other jurisdictions, maybe you have private business interests, maybe you have a vacation property in the US. That's all, complex stuff that maybe a layperson isn't the best choice. Second is if your family is complex, and this one's where the juicy stories come out.
We have time.
You might have, you might have a blended family. You might have siblings who don't get along. Really consider if you appointed one of your family members, how the other beneficiaries are going to respect that appointment. Will they ask a lot of questions? Will they respect the decisions that are made? Or will they make a very difficult estate administration period? Third reason is if you don't want to burden your family member. As we mentioned, the average estate takes 18 to 24 months. That's a lot of work, especially for individuals in the sandwich generation who maybe are taking care of their kids and maybe an aging parent and then also dealing with an estate. So it may not be prudent to appoint someone who's busy already. And then the last reason is if you just have no better alternative. Some people don't have children or they don't have children that are close to them. So professional really does take that role where there are no other options available.
No, that's really good because I think I don't know if I want to label it as a stigma, but the assumption of choosing as an executor, you think, well, it has to be someone that's close to me. It has to be a relative. It has to be someone in my circle. And that's just not necessarily the case, given circumstances.
And I found too, a lot of people sometimes will think that naming someone as an executor is an honor for them.
Yeah.
And in reality, it doesn't sound like that's always the case. When I speak to people like yourself, Jenna, or clients or friends who've been in the role, sometimes people would rather see a third party appointed to act instead of them. But I think sometimes what stops people from going down that path is maybe an assumption that it's going to be outrageously expensive. What's typically involved from a cost perspective in hiring a corporate executor? Like, because there's a number of them in the market. I imagine they all have their own fees. But like, how does that come in versus just having a family friend or someone naming their accountant or their lawyer or something like that?
Well, I will say what's interesting is that anyone can charge a fee, whether it's a professional executor or whether it's your neighbor, Bob Smith, down the street. And they can charge similar fees. And so if you're going to have an executor charge a fee, I always like to say, why not consider a professional? Just like your clients pay you to manage their money. They could do it on their own, but is it in their best interest? Will they get the maximum value that you provide? Probably not. So, it's really knowing the value that the executor puts on the table. So just to give the listeners a standpoint, most executors start around 4% of the value of the estate and then tier down as the assets increase. So on $1 million estate, you might be paying about 4%. On a $10 million estate, you're probably paying about half of that. And then it just decreases from there. A portion of that can be tax deductible as well. So the net offset to your estate is less than you might see when you initially sign up with a professional executor. And then professional executors do their job. I mean, they have the necessary contacts in the market to save the estate money. So they might have a realtor on speed dial, or they might have accountants that they use on a regular basis who can give discounts and secure discounts to benefit the estate.
And then corporate executors, so there's sort of two parts when it comes to dealing with an estate. We have the actual administration of the estate itself, but then we also sometimes have trusts set up and administering those trusts for beneficiaries. How does that role change for a corporate executor? Like, do they just seamlessly transition from one role to another if you want them to wear both hats, so to speak? Can you do that? Like what does that typically look like for families?
Well, that's great because, families get to choose exactly what they want. So in your will, you do assign an executor, and you also can assign a trustee for any trusts established through your will or through your estate. Most often that would be the same person, but sometimes you can split the role and have a professional executor act as your executor and maybe a family member act as trustee for any trust. So the role of the executor is really to wrap up the deceased affairs and then fund either the beneficiary's pockets with their inheritance or the trust, if that's what the will dictates. Once the trust is funded, then the trustee of that trust takes over. And that trust could exist for 1 year, it could exist for 5 years. It really depends on what the will outlines. I've seen trusts, exist for over 30 years. It just depends on what the deceased had wanted. During the time of the trust administration, the trustee is required to file tax returns, account to beneficiaries, consider requests that beneficiaries make if it is a discretionary type trust, make distributions, invest the money prudently, hire people like you to do the investment management, and really just do what's in the best interest of the beneficiaries while within those parameters that the deceased had laid out.
So, another question for you, I guess. Let's assume I'm named an executor, and I step into the role, and I take it on, and I realize after a little while that this is not what I thought it would be, and I just don't want to continue with this job anymore. It's become a burden. What options exist for me at that point to, I guess, lean on someone like a professional executor or another professional who can help me through that?
So there are a few options. One, I would say is the hardest option is going to court to resign formally. Most people don't do that after they've started through the estate administration. They try to continue through it. But that is one option available to executors if they absolutely cannot continue with that role. The second is hiring help. So you can hire an agent to do all the day-to-day administration of the estate while you remain in control of all the discretionary decisions. So the agent might get appraisals on the real property where you get to decide how much the house will be sold for. So it's really nice if you want to stay in control but do not want to do the day-to-day administration. And then the third could be just hiring those pieces out, hiring accounting help. Hiring, a lawyer to do probate, hiring a realtor to sell the house. So just hiring, who you need based on the deceased assets.
Yeah, that's a good question because I've encountered that myself with a client where they were named executor and they want nothing to do with it anymore, and given those circumstances. Yeah. And was asking, well, how do I pull out or how do I bring that up? Yeah. And so that's good that there are those options available, or even that we're naming these options available.
I will jump in here.
Yes, please.
So if somebody is named and the deceased passes away, before the executor even starts acting, takes any steps in the estate administration, they need to consider to themselves, am I willing to do this job? Because at the very beginning, it is quite easy to resign. You don't need to go to court if you haven't done any estate administration. It's just a one to 2 page sign off saying, I don't want to apply for probate, I don't want to be an executor, and then their hands are clean. Once you start intermeddling in the estate, then that's when you have to go to court. So executors do have lots of options with respect to that.
So let's say, Jenna, I imagine you get asked by family and friends if you'd be willing to be an executor for them, given your professional background. What are some things that would make you step in and say, you can't pay me enough to be executor in this situation? Like what are some red flags for you that might make an individual want to walk away from that role?
Great question. Number one red flag is if there's pending litigation or possible litigation. That can be very stressful and it can last several years. Another reason you might want to step away is if you are biased in some way. Maybe you have a conflict of interest. If you're a business owner with a deceased, maybe you shared business together, you'd be negotiating with yourself for the sale of that business. So if you're in a conflict of interest, it's probably not best for you to continue on. If you are a child of the deceased and you have to manage a trust for your stepmother, and for the stepmother's life, and then when the stepmother passes away, then you get the money. That's also a conflict of interest, because you probably want to make your inheritance as large as possible, but you should be taking care of your stepmother through their life. So those are some of the reasons. If the deceased hadn't filed tax returns and the records were not up to date, it would be a huge mess to try to get everything organized. You might consider if it's prudent for you to step down.
And then let's do an opposite situation here. What would happen for a listener who maybe didn't do a will on their own? They didn't appoint an executor. Who steps in to help them in that situation?
So somebody needs to apply to the court to actually get the authority to deal with the estate. And it's typically who's next in line to receive the assets of the deceased. So if the deceased was married, it might be the spouse who goes to court saying, my partner didn't have a will, give me the authority to deal with the assets. If they had kids, also kids would have the authority. So there's certain levels and stages that the court looks to. So if you have, basically your next of kin have the first right, and then it goes to your grandparents and extended family. So if you didn't have any close family, you could have a long lost cousin who comes forward saying, hey, I want to administer the estate because I'm going to get the money in the end. So it's always better to plan so you know who's getting the money, but I mean, there is a mechanism to help those individuals who die without a will.
We always ask at this time, what are we missing? What are some things maybe we didn't ask today, or something that the listeners should know about when it comes to the executor?
I would suggest that everyone ask the executor that they wish to appoint if they're willing to act. A lot of executors are surprised to know when they've been appointed, and it's often too late to change the will because the deceased had passed away. So number one, ask if they're willing to act. Number two, talk to your family about your decision, why you decided to appoint this individual, and why you decided to disperse your estate in a certain way. That can alleviate so many questions, get questions answered that would otherwise go unanswered if the family found out once the deceased had passed. Alternative to speaking about wealth while you're alive is writing a letter to your beneficiaries, explaining the reasons why you made certain decisions. Because I know some people like to be private, but it does alleviate a lot of litigation and concerns if you are a little bit more open.
So I'm going to turn that question on you, and you said talk to your beneficiaries, talk to your executor about the appointment. What if the roles were reversed and you were going to accept an appointment as someone's executor? What are some questions you should ask in that situation?
Great question. I love these, Wayne. Where is the original will held? How do I access your safety deposit box? Do you have a list of assets? Where do I get the statements? Does everything come online? Am I going to be able to get into your online accounts? How do I find your beneficiaries? That's one interesting thing. I've dealt with a lot of estates where the deceased passes away and we don't know where the beneficiaries are. We have to hire a private investigator to actually search them out. So having the contact details for all the beneficiaries is super helpful. And also just having a general conversation about what the deceased would want with respect to how to handle certain situations. So maybe there's a discretionary trust, and of course you can outline certain restrictions in the document, but you're not going to be able to plan for every scenario. So you can ask, how would you like me to generally handle requests to purchase a vehicle, or deal with health concerns. So just having an open conversation about their general philosophy is helpful.
Thank you so much for your time, Jenna. I mean, these are all fantastic points that should be taken seriously. And I really like how you tied it in with having that conversation. I mean, even from, Wayne can attest to you from a planning perspective and gathering information, and, us here at Cresco really wanting that 360 view, because it's not just linear. There are multi-generations involved, families and whatnot. So,
we could spend, I think, the whole day talking about this. I hope that you'll come back and we can go even further down. But until then, for those that are listening, how can they contact you? Whether it's your socials, email, phone numbers, things of that nature, if they want to dive a little bit deeper into this.
Yes, I'm always open on email or telephone. So email is jenna@guardianestate.ca, and you can visit us on our website as well as guardianestate.ca. Or, of course, ask these lovely gentlemen here for my contact details, and they can put you in touch with me.
There we go. We'll be the executors of the information. Yeah, I tried. I was
quarterback.
the quarterback. I was reaching for one of them.
Bit of a stretch.
Yeah, a little bit. No, but thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it. Again, for all those listening, Podbean, Spotify, you can stream the podcast, and hopefully we'll have you back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Jenna.